The biggest barrier to getting started is getting started. The number of times we see people who've got great ideas that then don't actually commit to action. So actually just doing something is generally the biggest barrier for anyone to starting.
Getting access to funding is the big one, although I think this is getting easier in Australia. You're not seeing fintech firms needing to go overseas as much as perhaps we were 6 months or a year ago. Accelerators or financial technology hubs that can help a lot of startups with this kind of thing. For example, Stone and Chalk, the Tyro Fintech Hub, Blue Chili, places like that. And what these places provide fintech startups is a space to do what they need to do. Like that means that they're not in their parents' garage or something like that. They've got a space where there are a lot of other people in the same situation that they are, that they can collaborate with. And that's got to help their confidence, and it's got to help them from a mentoring point of view as well.
And look, overall, I think the Australian startup ecosystem has always been pretty healthy from a creativity point of view. We like some of the distinct advantages in other markets. In Silicon Valley, they've got both the depth of capital and experience to take those really big, long-term, disruptive kind of plays, whereas the Australian capital environment has traditionally been about shorter-term, revenue-driven models.
There's always an ongoing battle to fund startups. Different places or different jurisdictions have different levels of skill and capabilities of doing that. Traditionally, you'll think of the Silicon Valley startups where there seems to be huge amounts of money available. But that's increasingly becoming the case in other parts of the world as well. There's funding hubs in China, in Japan, even in Australia now. You're seeing a much greater focus on startups and venture capital and innovation funding.
Startup is actually the easiest part of technology or fintech, whatever, in my humble opinion, because again, coming back to those pillars, you find a problem and you find a simple way to solve that problem. Now, the good thing in Australia, we've got a really good financing for startups. We've got lots and lots of incubators now taking off, collaborative working environments in like Stone and Chalk and all these places. And it's actually a great time to be in a startup. But to me, the interesting thing is, where do all those startups go?
In terms of scaling, historically capital's been a barrier, but I think that's changing in the landscape here. Still probably the biggest barrier for Australian scaling startups are access to experienced, talented people in the technology space.
What we're ignoring at the moment in this stampede for startups is that next stage. And that is actually the really hard stage, going from an idea between the founders in an incubator to actually turning it into a commercial venture. And again, the article's saying there's just not much money around for that stage. And unless we address that, they're going to sprout and die.
The other thing is obviously the Australian market is dominated by the 4 large banks, and so they do have this kind of monopoly on financial services, retail services, so that can make it very hard, especially when you're in the VC phase and trying to raise capital, because one of the questions you're always going to have to answer is, well, what's going to stop the large banks from coming in and doing this? What are the barriers of entry for the banks coming in and taking the market share from you, which is probably a question you don't face if you're in other jurisdictions like the UK or in the US with VC funding. And the other thing is that we don't really have a developed VC funding market here in Australia like you do in the US. So the banks are developing VC funds which will fund venture, fintech startups, but you have to get through their process. And if you get selected, then you have an access to funds, but you'll also be tied to whichever bank is providing you those funds.
Access to data, and this is one other space where the incumbents have a very strong hold. They have a lot of the data. So to the extent that new players are trying to look at ways, interesting ways to analyse data or use data, they're kind of hampered because the people holding the data are the traditional incumbents. So that's another space that's really important. So I do think that kind of leads to those teaming up arrangements we talked about before as being really critical for both the incumbents and the new players.
Is one, it's not all about the technology, it's also about understanding the regulations. And I think a lot of people miss that you can just create the greatest technology, but if you don't understand how the regulations work, you're really just not going to get it off the ground.
Financial services is a highly regulated sector. So what you have is a series of startups trying to navigate their way through that regulation and trying to understand whether the idea they've come up with, the product they might have come up with, fits or doesn't fit into that financial services regulation. Do they need to get an AFSL licence, for example, or can their product operate without the need for that? Do they need to have a certain amount of funding to be able to provide their product, or are they able to do that, in a sense, getting around or not needing to deal with the level of regulation that might exist for their competitor products? So really it's in those two spaces that we see the fintech startups doing most of the work at the moment to try to understand how they fit.
There is a regulatory mismatch. Every country is looking at it differently, that's one thing. But even within country, we've got the regulators who regulate the financial markets and the regulators who regulate sort of business as a whole and are very supportive of innovation and all this type of stuff. They don't exactly see eye to eye on a lot of stuff. And in many countries, they haven't actually sat around the same table and actually had a conversation about it. So you've got one group of regulators telling you this, another group telling you something different, and it's very hard to match that up. So that's one of the challenges that we particularly see. It's a particular challenge for startups because without any clarity around what they need to do, they know they're going into sort of uncharted territory anyway, and there's going to be an education process with whoever they're talking to from a government perspective, but not really having at least a map which they can follow to go through and understanding who they need to talk to and where the sensitivities are is a real challenge.
Asia is a collection of a whole host of different countries, and we all have very different laws. It's not like Europe in terms of a one-stop shop. Anyone entering this market has to look at each and every jurisdiction and consider the differences and the unique natures of every law. Some jurisdictions are stricter than others in terms of requirements, and in order to provide an Asia-wide solution, companies have got to consider compliance with each law.